I'm Professor Mark Howden from the Climate Change Institute in Australian National University. I'm also a Vice Chair of IPCC Working Group 2. The IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees had a series of results which I think are pertinent to finance and investment. So one of them was that the evidence is very clear that humans are having an impact on climate change. So when we look at, say, the temperature record and differentiate between the human influence and the natural influences, those natural influences are effectively flatlining, not going up, not going down much at all, just a little bit of variation with volcanic activity, whereas the human influences through greenhouse gas emissions are driving up temperatures across the globe. And when we combine the natural influences and the human influences, there's a very close correspondence between the modelled combined effect and the observed temperatures across the globe. So the evidence is in pretty clearly that humans are causing climate change. And in fact, some assessments are that there's less than a 1 in 100,000 chance that it's not humans that are driving climate change. So one of the implications of that is that we need to start taking into account climate change in terms of our decisions in finance, investment, as well as many other domains of human activity. Now, one of the things that can be framed in terms of finance decisions is comes out of a structure from the what's called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And the TCFD has essentially a framework to assess climate change risks as part of transparency and accountability in relation to climate change. So the 4 basic risk categories are transition risk, that particularly relates to changing our structures, particularly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's also a physical risk component, which is often related to adapting to changes such as heat waves or sea level rise, increased storminess and storm intensity. There's a liability risk, and that associates particularly with legal action, which can actually arise from past decisions which have not taken into account climate change effectively. And there's also a reputational risk that arises from not dealing with climate change adequately. So we can sort of break down that if we want to, but I haven't got time here to do that. But looking at a couple of things, one is that mitigation or emission reduction activity. So very clearly, countries like Australia and New Zealand have a range of different sectors, and they are quite unique from other countries. So for example, Australia has a strong component in terms of the mining industry and fugitive emissions. New Zealand has a very strong component in terms of the agriculture sector. And Australia's is quite large compared with our peer groups as well. So when we're starting to think about financial investment, one of the things is to look at those investments in relation to existing emissions and their prospect for emission reductions, or for substituting things like carbon credits for emission-heavy sectors. So by factoring in those opportunities, you can have a better handle on what the investment prospects are, given the possibilities for changing requirements by governments in terms of emission reductions. So generally speaking, we're going to have to reduce our emissions by something like 45% by 2030 and effectively go to net zero by 2050 if we're to meet the lower of the 2 Paris Agreement goals, that's 1.5 degrees. So that's a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in those different timeframes. And so when we're investing, I would actually argue that we need to take into account those sorts of emission reductions in our investments. So not looking at investments which are going to have difficulty in that downward trajectory for emissions because you actually may get caught up in problematic situations. The other one is in terms of adaptation. So given climate is changing and lots of hazards and risks associated with climate are changing, so exposure, for example, to cyclones, exposure to drought or floods, heat waves, similar factors. It's necessary, given that we've got a change in climate, we also need to change the risk profile in terms of those potential impacts. And so if you're in a business or investing in a business which has climate influences on it, then taking into account those climate change in terms of risks associated with that business will become increasingly important over time. There are various requirements emerging now in terms of the Corporations Act in Australia, which there's been various legal opinions by Noel Hutley and amongst others, which have been taken up by APRA, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, which effectively say that the effects of climate change right now are material, they're actionable, and they're relevant to immediate decision making, and putting up the proposition that if current company boards and others with responsibility for company decision making, if they don't take climate change into account, then they could well be in breach of the Corporations Act. So there's a strong legal incentive to start to think about climate change and to act on it. So as I mentioned before, one of those frameworks that can be taken into account is the TCFD framework, which has the different risk characteristics, and starting to apply that to your business investments. And it's not just the regulators who are requiring this. You've also got some of the really biggest investors like BlackRock and Vanguard globally, who are also requiring that sort of risk management that takes climate change factors into account, both mitigation, which is emission reduction, and also adaptation. So increasingly, I think what we'll see is that's going to be both a requirement within the business sector, from governments and the regulators, and also from the community, is to demonstrate that investments are meeting those requirements in terms of emission reduction and adaptation, which are going to be needed in terms of future climate change decision making. And when we're thinking about that, oftentimes there's interactions between emission reduction activities and climate adaptation. So for example, if you're investing in a forest plantation, which either for productive reasons or as a carbon sink, it may be in an environment where there's an increased risk of fire associated with climate change. And so the ability to adapt to that risk of climate change by improved fire management would be a factor in terms of thinking about your investment decision. So if you actually start to think about that systematically, is that many things that happen in places like Australia are one way or the other influenced by climate, either directly or through supply chains or value chains, or through regulatory requirements, or through community perspectives, and taking those things systematically into account, looking at the interactions between emission reduction and adaptation and sustainable development goals will be increasingly part of the expectations of consumers.